All right, welcome to our first mailbag for Film 240 Introduction to Film. I'm your host, Peter Castor, and this is the time of the week where I'll be answering your questions. So, first we have from Austin. Can you go into more detail explaining cultural and cinematic invisibility and what they mean? Absolutely. Let's first start with explicit and implicit meaning. So, in a film, explicit meaning is what happens, what you see on screen, what characters say. As such, the explicit meaning of the Atlas commercial is a grandmother of a family is mourning the loss of her husband, the grandfather, who apparently was an immigrant and wanted the whole family to drive cross country together. So she relays this information to her children and her grandchildren, and then they do this cross country road trip. The implicit meaning is that driving a Volkswagen can bring your family together, that driving across the country can bring your family together, and especially given that the song is the Simon and Garfunkel song that features the lyrics "Looking for America," then we can find not only family but nation. Those would be the implicit meanings, the implied meanings. Now, of course, these implied meanings are subjective. The notion is that while there might be multiple interpretations that are accurate, there are plenty that are inaccurate. So it would be false to say that an implied meaning of that commercial was a staunch resistance to Marxist socialism, because there's no evidence in the commercial that suggests that that's the case. So if that's explicit and implicit meaning, then we move on to cultural and cinematic invisibility. Well, the cinematic invisibility comes when the director of the work takes tremendous care to conceal the edits, in effect. Indeed, in The Russian Ark, this was done so well that some of you referred to the editing of that sequence, and yet the whole point of The Russian Ark is, for its entire nearly 2-hour runtime, there is not a single cut. Right. So the degree to which that was so artfully concealed, a couple of you felt that there were multiple edits, when in fact there are no cuts whatsoever. So another example of cinematic invisibility would be in the Atlas commercial, where the producers shoot the shots and edit them. They want to compress a cross-country voyage into a brief commercial. And as such, as many of you noticed, that's a montage, a sequence of shots often strung together by music, and we presume then that a lot of time has passed. So rather than being disoriented by the cuts, we're quite comfortable with them. In like fashion, many of you were bored by Russian Ark precisely because there were no cuts in its 9-minute runtime. As for those of you who asked why this movie exists in the first place, largely it exists as a cinematic tour de force. An hour and 45 minutes of a single unbroken shot, which means that if anybody makes a mistake, a camera person, an actor, then the whole thing has to be done again. The technology available when this film was made was such that the recording material was shot on video because you could not have that almost 2 hours worth of film. Film reel is only about 20 minutes long. So they had 5 hard drives and they were single use, and it was on the 5th one, the hard drive in the backpack of the cinematographer holding a Steadicam, that they finally pulled off the whole staged sequence. So it's a spectacular effort technologically speaking, but of course in terms of a story being told, it's of no interest to us, for most of us anyway, because it's effectively a tour of the Russian Museum. So if that's cinematic invisibility, the degree to which filmmakers attempt to conceal the very art by which they tell their stories, cultural invisibility is the set of assumptions that films assume we participate in. So, for example, there's nothing particular or particularly forward about men being in charge in, the vast swathe of superhero movies to this point. However, until the introduction of the standalone Wonder Woman film, every standalone action superhero film focuses on male characters. So the presumption then, the cultural invisibility, is in a sense that only men can be heroes, which is of course, an entirely bankrupt notion and is rooted in larger notions of patriarchy and that we all participate in. Nevertheless, it's something that's rendered less visible, that we have to draw it out. Similarly, the Apatow comedies seem to be pretty raunchy, and yet if we look at films like Knocked Up, the film concludes with the birth parents joining together to raise the child, which is a kind of fundamentally conservative principle that the birth parents should raise the child. So for all of their surface raunchiness, they actually have a relatively conservative message. The same could be said of Something About Mary, which is again very raunchy throughout, and yet concludes with, you should be with your high school crush, which is again a pretty reductive and conservative idea. Next up, a related question from Tyler. Without cinema or cultural invisibility in film, how would they shape filmmakers, if they're still trying to get a message across? Would it be just blatant, or would they try to keep it hidden? Well, the trick here is to shift back and forth between message and story. So, in communication studies, the presumption is that a speaker or writer or maker is attempting to communicate a message to an audience. Whereas in the convention of storytelling, we tell a story in order to please and instruct, to go back to Aristotle's definition of poetics. In pleasing and instructing, these can be at odds, right? So in The Fog of War, which we'll watch a clip of this week, the director is a documentarian attempting to tell a story of a man and U.S. and world history. And he does so using interview footage with Robert McNamara, as well as footage of World War II and of Vietnam and of other footage from the 1960s. So he's got a direct message, an explicit message in compiling this footage, but also an implicit message. And it's less that filmmakers put these things in or keep them hidden, but they are intractable. We are pattern-making animals, and so we look around ourselves and we try to make meaning from what's around us. Next up, Portia Glover asks, when making a film, how do you know what angles are necessary? Or the lighting or color choice for the visual? Also, how do you determine if you have the perfect shot or scene? Also, which one is trickier, shooting in inclement weather or shooting at night? Well, that last one, the film industry has taken a page from the Air Force and treats night as weather, in effect. They both present their own challenges. So in the case of night, historically, filmmakers have had to use a faster speed of footage. Now, contemporary digital cameras are often capable in shooting in much lower light. An example of inclement weather that's kind of interesting is the filmmaker Akira Kurosawa needed rain. The set for this particular moment in Rashomon needed to be raining, to be dismal and sad. And it wasn't raining. And so instead he just had a bunch of water sprayed, which is pretty conventional for filmmaking. And the water didn't look right on film, so he had to put ink in the water. So sometimes filmmakers make up their own weather in order to convey the implicit meaning they desire, even at tremendous effort. But in terms of what angles are necessary, well, it really kind of depends. And so in the classical Hollywood studio era, which we'll get to a little bit later this semester and this week, it was conventional for the producer, who was the most important person in filmmaking at this time, to indicate to the director to shoot any number of different sequences. So they might shoot the exact same scene with the camera in a long shot, and then shoot it again in an extreme long shot, shoot it again in a medium shot with the camera angled one way, then angled the other. This allowed the producer, who was never on the set in the first place, to look through the various possibilities and select which one he, and in this time it was almost exclusively he, preferred. So that might, in that sense, this was also an era of the power of the studios and thus the producer, and also of stars. And of course, stars are still important, but that a producer might want to push a certain star. Maybe they're really expensive and they want them to have a lot of screen time to get audiences to come. In which case, the producer is going to favor close-ups of the actress as opposed to a long shot or a medium shot. Next up comes from Fernando. My question is about technology used in filmmaking today. The book talks about how film is still the most widely used medium for movies. Even with the most recent advances in technology, would we still say that the film medium is better? Well, it's certainly more widely available, and most theaters are set up for screening film as opposed to screening digital. This is changing slowly, and indeed the Star Wars prequels, directed by Lucas and released by Lucasfilm, were part of an effort to shift to digital, where then instead of shipping 4,000 copies at the expense of 2,000 per copies of their movie across the country, which means before your movie even gets to the theater, the distributor's already spent $8 million shipping this movie all over the country. Well, instead, the signal could just be beamed from satellite into the theater. But that does involve a significant turnover of theaters that is even greater than what happened when synchronic sound was developed between 1927 and became the norm in 1929. All of the film theaters in the country had to revamp so that they were prepared not only to show film while somebody played piano or perhaps there was a small orchestra, but instead they would show a film that had a synchronic soundtrack etched on it, and it would play simultaneously. Now, video recording, digital video recording, has almost caught up to film in terms of the level of detail that can be captured. A 35 millimeter film strip can capture a level of detail in excess of 4,000 pixels. So we're right now at the threshold of moving from 4K to 8K digital technology, which will allow digital video to capture the same resolution of 35 millimeter film, though not 70 millimeter film. Nevertheless, shooting on film has become so standard that even for filmmakers who prefer digital, they have seen most of the video they've seen, or most of the films they've seen, were originally captured on film. And as such, there are characteristics of shooting on film that include lens flares and scratching, and that this appears a certain way on the screen. And so actually in digital film editing software, you can introduce these sorts of errors in order to make the video seem more realistic, which is to say it looks more like film. Our next comment and question comes from Caitlin. She points out that we've distinguished camera movement techniques and lighting as having an impact on the story within films. And you're going to get some practice on that as you work on your scene description and analysis assignment. So read that assignment carefully, and as Caitlin points out, how the camera moves or doesn't move, what the lighting is like. This is all really, really important, and it helps shape the implicit meaning of the film through you rendering the cinematic invisibility more visible by taking a sequence of film 15 to 30 seconds long, analyzing it very, very carefully, watching it many times, and then painstakingly describing what's happening, how long are the shots, what's the proximity of the camera to the subject, etc. Now, Caitlin also points out how sound is really important, and this is pretty easy insofar as if you watch a horror film with the sound off, it's not very scary in most cases. Also, if you're watching a romance and the sad love song cues in, well, it helps teach the audience how to feel and enhance their feeling in response to the events they're seeing on screen. But Caitlin points out, I don't understand how editing plays such a part in filmmaking. How does it impact characters, the tone of a story? So a good example of this would be in The Russian Ark, which many of you were fascinated by, if bored by, because it features no editing. So that has a very different pace. If something takes 9 minutes of story time, it also takes 9 minutes of watching time. Now contrast that with Atlas, which through the technique of montage and having very rapid editing, allows us to condense an entire cross-country journey into a 45-second commercial. Now, of course, initially, watching that would be very choppy, but the overall song of Looking for America matching what we're seeing on screen allows the sequence to seem complete, especially because most of us have seen a lot of commercials or music videos. We've grown accustomed to rapid-fire editing. Another canonical example would be Alfred Hitchcock's 1960 film Psycho, where he shows a character being attacked in the shower with a knife, and it's the canonical example of rapid-fire editing. In a sequence of maybe 30 seconds, there's maybe 45 shots, so shots of less than a second, which we see a knife, we see a screaming woman, we see blood in the water, we see a knife, we see a defensive posture of a hand, we see blood in the water, and it seems as if we're actually seeing her get stabbed, when in fact, of course, that's not the case. So editing can be incredibly important. It can be used thematically, as in Francis Ford Coppola's 1972 The Godfather. In a famous sequence at the end, there's cross-cutting, cutting back and forth between two scenes of parallel action. So while Al Pacino's character, Michael Corleone, is attending the baptism of his nephew, his infant nephew, and he follows the words of the priest to renounce all works of Satan, his assassins are carrying out a series of hits on other mob bosses and brutally assassinating them. So there's the contrast between him claiming to renounce Satan while he's in fact having these orders carried out. And without that editing, that scene would lack any of its existing punch. Another example would be in the concluding shootout of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, featuring Clint Eastwood by Sergio Leone. And a sequence basically lasts for 6 minutes, and it's 3 guys standing in a triangle looking at each other, and then one of them gets shot. It's, in terms of the content, it's really boring, but it's made incredibly tense through the editing as the shots get closer and closer, from extreme long shots to extreme close-ups featuring only eyes. As the sequence begins with those shots lasting 9 seconds, and then slowly they get shorter and shorter and shorter until at the end they're very, very brief. And Enrico Morricone's sound, his score, is just incredibly intense and gets sort of tighter and tighter and tighter. So if you want YouTube, Good, the Bad, and the Ugly shootout, and you'll see the power of editing when it is linked to music, as it is in Atlas, and when it's linked to direction itself, where the camera is with respect to the characters. Our next question comes from Chris. I wanted to know your personal thoughts about short, low-budget films. Do you enjoy them? Do you feel that the acting is as good as a big-budget film? Do you prefer big-budget film or small film festival types of work? Well, I love both. I actually was the director and producer of the 2014 Expecting Goodness Short Film Festival, which featured exclusively low-budget short films. I've made a number of short films or participated in other folks' short films. And it's a vibrant, sort of popular art form. It's amazing what we can do with contemporary technology. In terms of, and I continue to assign them. So later this week, we're going to watch a short film that was entered at that festival. And in a couple of weeks, we're going to watch a really fantastic, powerful short film coming out of Australia named Cargo. Now, of course, there's stories that small-budget films have a tremendous difficulty telling, right? So Transformers has to be a big-budget movie, or it would probably be just absolutely terrible and unwatchable. Of course, I find it unwatchable anyway. But let's look at a film like Braveheart. Fantastic, right? Powerful story, strong characters, deeply effective for many people. And yet, at its root, the implied meaning is that an unimportant, unknown person can, through force of will, change history. But the actor playing that role is Mel Gibson, who's already famous. So, in a sense, I think the film would be more powerful if it was an unknown actor. But then, if it were an unknown actor, the studio would be far less likely to risk the large investment of the filmmaking budget because they want the insurance of a star to draw in audiences. So there's stories that big-budget films can tell perhaps more successfully, and there's also stories that low-budget films can tell more successfully. Also, I don't have access to a $100 million budget, but I have a phone, so I can make a movie. Next up from Mia, why do you think long takes aren't used more frequently in movies? Many movies cut from shot to shot. Well, honestly, it's just harder. It requires actors knowing their lines better and able to memorize lengthy sequences. It requires a camera operator, a cinematographer, which is, say, a director of photography, who can hold the camera, who can go through the camera movement and position without interruption, because again, in a long take, any mistake means you have to shoot the entire thing again. Now, Russian Ark obviously took this to its furthest extent with a full-length feature-length film, which is all one long take. Alfred Hitchcock in 1948, Rope, did something very, very similar. He wanted the film to feel claustrophobic, and so virtually the entire movie takes place inside of an apartment. And it also features these very, very lengthy takes of up to 10 minutes. And even then, when there is a cut, it's concealed by a swish pan across the back of a character wearing a dark jacket. So the screen goes black just for an instant, which is a place where those two reels of film can be spliced together. So clearly we've seen this done more recently in Birdman. There's scenes in Fight Club and Goodfellas and many of Brian De Palma's films that feature very, very long takes. They require extensive rehearsal, they require actors who can memorize and deliver their lines over time, and they require many other aspects of planning and production. So they can also be more lifelike, closer to what mid-20th century film theorist Andrei Bazin called true cinema, in that it is, he claimed, more immersive, when there is deep depth of field and lengthy takes, so we're not distracted by rapid cuts. Yay, one that I can answer more briefly. Olivia asks, how many different steps are there in making a film? Like, for an example, about how long does it take to make and produce a film? Well, obviously it completely varies. So it's become pretty conventional for a medium to large budget feature film in the United States to cost $100 million or more, $120 million. And its runtime is going to be 110 to 120 minutes. And we're going to spend between 80 and 140 days in pre-production, production, and post-production, the three phases of filmmaking. Now, of course, some films take much, much, much longer. They sit in pre-production hell, where producers decide, well, are we going to make it? Are we not going to make it? The script gets sent around, right? And then there's other times when the production time itself takes so long. The sort of famous example here would be Boyhood, where the film follows the same actual person and actor playing a semi-autobiographical role, and rather than use multiple actors or makeup, the film just spends some 10 years of production time getting together once a year to shoot more scenes, so the same person can grow up. Other times films are trapped in post-production. For example, in American History X, the director, who was a debut director in 1998, spent forever editing and editing and editing. And finally, the studio took the film away from him, and reportedly Edward Norton stepped in and supervised the conclusion of the editing, which largely reorganized the narrative around him and his character's role. But in general, when we're thinking of medium to large American would-be blockbusters costing, $120 million, they take about 120 days for 120 minutes of footage on the screen, which means that for every minute of footage you're watching, $1 million has been spent. And for every day that folks were working on the film, $1 million was being spent. Great question from Will. Viewer expectations are discussed in Chapter 1. Why do movie trailers show so much of the plot and of the movie? Do trailers create viewer expectations that are too high? It depends. That the trailer's primary goal is to get people to go to the theater and see the movie. And the trailer has, and those who make trailers have learned to appeal to, in some sense, the lowest common denominator. So trailers have become such an art form that now, of course, we have trailers for trailers, or a teaser for a subsequent trailer, and then a subsequent trailer for the same film, and finally the film is released. For would-be blockbusters, like any of the Star Wars films, for example, these trailers are incredibly important because the film costs so much money to make and the studio has so much invested that everybody needs to go see the movie, ideally a couple of times, for the film to break even. I say that because if a film costs $200 million to make, another $80 to $130 million will be spent advertising it prior to its release. You add to that the 2,000 copies or the 4,000 copies of the film set around the country at a cost of $2,000 a piece, and the fact that you had to start spending money during pre-production, production, and post-production prior to ever making any money in release, that what studios have invested really needs to be insured in as many capacities as possible, and one of those is to heavily market. Now, unfortunately, for those of us who like to go to the movies and get a new experience, these immersive trailers that give away too much are really frustrating. So I've learned just to not watch them. Of course, other times trailers don't tell enough of the story about the movie, and the audience doesn't know what they're getting, and then they don't like it because their expectations aren't met. This was the case with Shawshank Redemption in 1994 and Fight Club in 1999. The film distributors didn't really understand what they had or how to market it or who the audience was, so the movies died at the box office and only became not only cult classics, but extraordinarily well-evaluated films only after their theatrical run. and they made all of their money back in ancillary markets such as playing on cable and in DVD releases. All right, next up from Kendra. Upon reading Chapter 11, I noticed the movie rating system listed in Table 11.5. Over the years, we've had some extremely graphic movies come out, but I don't believe I've ever seen a movie labeled NC-17. With that being said, why do you think we don't use this rating more often? Well, Kendra, that's a really great question, and it's got a complex answer that has to do with history and U.S. social and cultural mores. It has to do with gender. Most of all, it has to do with economics. So a quick history lesson here. Until 1968, there was no rating system. Every film released in the United States in a theater was effectively rated G, which is why when we look at 1940s or 1950s action films, detective films, crime films, gangster films, somebody pulls the trigger and then somebody else leans over, and it's not very realistic. But that's because the filmmaker could not show anything more explicit. This is because in 1933, the Production Code Authority, working within Hollywood, had a list of things that could and could not be shown, effectively self-censorship. So as U.S. audiences changed in the 40s and 50s and 60s, these rules relaxed a little bit, but it wasn't until 1968 when Jack Valenti, then head of the MPAA, declared to Congress that this was no longer tenable, that we could no longer self-censor. His point was that people in their homes could watch the news on ABC at 7 p.m. or 5 p.m. and watch actual people getting shot in Vietnam, and it seemed silly to censor violence in fictional films. So Valenti introduced the rating system, which we've come to know as G, PG, PG-13, R, and NC-17. Now, this is where economics comes in. If a film is rated R, then immediately it is restricting its audience. And for would-be big-budget films, this is untenable. This is why it's not until, I believe, Deadpool and then Logan, well, and yeah, occasional other exceptions, that the blockbuster world of the Marvel Comics universe saw fit to make a rated R superhero film. Prior to this, they were all PG or PG-13 in order to attract the largest audience possible. So once a film distributor has seen their film labeled R or PG, PG-13, PG-13 is kind of the sweet spot because it can be edgy enough to attract not just kids, but also safe enough that kids can go see it. Now, the point you make, the shift from R to NC-17, is a deal breaker for most films. There's many theaters which will not even screen an NC-17 film. And as such, the distributor will not release it as an NC-17 version. The popularity of video has made it more likely then that the film would be initially released as an R film, and then there might be a R and an NC-17 DVD release. Now, certainly some large sellers like Walmart won't even sell an NC-17 copy, and so these are decisions that the producers and distributors have to make in an ancillary market, the market after the theaters. Now, it's not just that folks changed in terms of what they wanted to see during the 60s, they still are changing. And this happened very quickly. For example, the film Midnight Cowboy was released in 1969 and features Jon Voight, you know him as Angelina Jolie's dad, and Dustin Hoffman. And it initially received an X rating due to its explicit content. It also won Best Picture, which demonstrated that there was a willingness and sort of a willingness to accept violent or erotically charged narratives as art at the time. Well, 2 years later, the rating of the film was revised to R, which means that just in those 2 years, the sort of social sense of what was appropriate, possible to show on the screen changed. So it's continued to change, though in the United States, and this is quite different from Europe, audiences' comfort, or at least exhibitors' anticipation of audiences' comfort, has relaxed much more with regard to violence than with regard to sex. So we can see much, much more explicit scenes of violence in PG-13 films that used to require a PG-13 or an R. We can see much more explicit scenes of violence in an R-rated film that previously would have been not approved at all. But the ratings board has been much more conservative in allowing a shift in tone with regard to sex and sexuality. This also turns out to sort of fall along lines of gender and sexuality. So full frontal nudity for a woman can appear in a film, but full frontal nudity for a man is far, far more rare, far less explicit, and is far more likely to get an NC-17. Similarly, explicit sexuality in a heterosexual environment is much more likely to get an R, whereas the same level of explicitness for a homosexual couple on screen is much more likely to get an NC-17. That's it for today, folks. We'll have one of these each week. Make sure you ask questions that you want to know the answer to and you think your classmates might like to as well. And any material covered in these mailbags is part of the course content, and you are eligible to be quizzed or tested on the material. Have a great week. Bye.